Katie Pilbeam. Welcome to the show. This week we discuss the most sought-after commodities: oil, gold and cocoa. Plus the new G7, cats and cars, the 1% and Europeans all speaking English. That's all on the way. But first of all, we're going to get stuck in and talk about oil, because this week the benchmark Brent crude fell to its lowest level in about 4 years. The price has dropped about 25% since June. So as you can see, it's gone from around $113 a barrel right down here to about 83. So it's been in this free fall situation for about 4 months now, as you can see. Now, a global slump in demand, really led by China, combined with a continued slowdown in the Eurozone, as well as with continued growth in US shale production and Saudi Arabia wanting to keep hold of market share, has all led to this excess in capacity. Now, the International Energy Administration lowered its crude oil demand projections for 2014 to about 200,000 barrels per day from the current 700,000 barrels per day. This is the lowest forecast since 2009. So we're now going to speak to Patrick Young from DV Advisors to discuss all of this in more detail. Patrick Young, DV Advisors, we've got you in the VentureCapital studio. Really pleased to have you with us today. Now listen, what is affecting oil prices right now, in your opinion?
I think there's a cluster of things affecting oil prices right at the moment. I mean, what we're looking at, Katie, is obviously this whole issue to do with something like ISIS is fundamentally having an issue and effect. I mean, they control a large number of barrels of oil per day. They control perhaps 60 to 80,000 barrels of oil each day. Now, if you think about it and you multiply that by even an $80 oil price, that's a lot of money that's going to them. Ultimately, they're trying to recycle that into the economy. They do that through a group of rather dodgy Turkish middlemen, and then the oil manages to find its way sort of laundered onto the black market, as it were, and then ultimately supplied to consumers in different places. Therefore, what we're seeing is, in one sense, the price is probably being pushed down or held down by certain interests who are trying to strangle ISIS to some degree. There's been a lot of talk recently that this may involve Saudi Arabia. Now, what we know is that the price of producing the oil in a lot of places in the Middle East can often be around $80 per barrel or higher. In fact, I think the average price in Saudi Arabia is reputed to be about $85 per barrel. Intriguingly, the Saudi Arabians seem to be entering forward contracts. That's contracts where they're selling oil to be delivered maybe 6 months, maybe a year, even 2 years down the road. And they're actually apparently willing to sell that at $80 or less. So they're in fact turning around and saying, we're going to sell oil at a loss going forward. And people presume that this is at least in part to try and neuter ISIS, because ISIS have to sell their oil at a discount to the world price. If ISIS are being pushed down to perhaps $70 or $65 or $60 a barrel, that actually means that in the long term, they cannot produce oil very profitably in the wells that they control in parts of Syria and also parts of Iraq. That seems to be a very large part of what's happening to the oil picture. There's also global macroeconomics.
That's what I was going to say. So what part is all of that playing in, the macroeconomics? The Eurozone, US supply, as well as Saudi Arabia wanting to keep their market share?
Well, there's two things at play here, quite obviously. I mean, the first thing is, actually, the United States of America, God bless it, the largest economy in the world, and it has finally achieved a kind of escape exit velocity. It's growing considerably, the economy is coming roaring back, and therefore, obviously, they do have quite a lot of demand for oil. But of course, at the same time, they're producing a lot of their own oil themselves. They don't have energy independence yet. It may be some way down the road, but they're not importing as much oil as they required previously. That, therefore, makes life more difficult for exporters like Saudi Arabia. The Eurozone, well, my goodness, unfortunately, it would lovely to be optimistic about the Eurozone. I simply have not been able to be so for the last 18 months, and now it seems the fact that actually even a lot of the burghers of Brussels themselves have realised just how sickly the economy is. And we really do have a fundamental problem there. I mean, the European Union is not growing. The European Union has massive unemployment. It is also, to use a piece of sort of slightly Celtic dialect, it's cutting off its nose to spite its face through things like sanctions, so that's trimmed another 0.2–0.3% off GDP in Europe, and ultimately, therefore, oil demand is much less. That impacts Saudi Arabia, impacts everybody who wants to export their oil. At the same time, we're looking at the fact that China may not be growing quite as staggeringly as it has been in recent years. Still growing. The East is rising. There's no argument about that. But in the big picture, they're not demanding as much oil as they were demanding 2 or 3 years ago, in part because, of course, they don't have as many European consumers wildly keen to buy their products. So overall, the oil market looks to be rather stagnant in terms of demand. And actually, if we look at the macro picture again, oil, there is a lot more oil around than I think anybody expected to see at this stage, because there are all sorts of sources, such as tar sands in Canada, the shale revolution in North America and other parts. Nonetheless, there is a lot more oil around, chasing fewer consumers.
Patrick Young from DV Advisors, thank you so much for coming into the studio here in central Moscow.
You're welcome.
The latest IMF economic report has sparked talk of a new G7. The 7 largest emerging markets now have more capital in purchasing power parity. So I'm talking about Brazil, Russia, India and China, which are otherwise known as the BRICS, along with Mexico, Indonesia and Turkey. So they have a combined GDP of $37.8 trillion. Now, the current G7, in the blue right here, have a total of $34.5 trillion. So this would be Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK and the US. This is all in PPP though, which is the rate of exchange between two currencies that gives them equal purchasing powers in their own economies. Now, I discussed all of this global shift this week with one of the world's best known business thinkers. He's an author as well, Dr. Jonas Ridderstraal.
We're going to see a big shift. Today still, the global middle class is still very much dominated by the West, by the United States, Canada, and Western Europe. If we look ahead 25 years into the future, the global middle class will be dominated by Chinese, Indians, Indonesians, Nigerians perhaps, Russians, and I think the global middle class is pretty darn critical, because the global middle class tends to decide what is good, what is bad, what is beautiful, what is ugly. It has a tendency to influence what is dominant design in our economy, and that shift we haven't seen. Yes, we see lots of interesting things happening in Asia, in Africa, in South America, and in Eastern Europe. But dominant design is still very much determined by Americans, by Germans, by the French, by the British, even by the Swedes at times. But that is going to change.
And can we focus in on China? Because in less than 10 years' time, China will be the biggest economy in the world. And I wonder how the power shift will change, because obviously the US has had that throne for so long and used it in many ways political. How will that change? Will China have to really step up and be noticed on the political agenda too?
I think the big change we're seeing is not necessarily a shift there from the east to the west. I think the big shift is a shift from an economy that used to have one center. That's the kind of economy we're used to. The center used to be Europe, then the center became the United States. There was a brief Japanese kind of 1980s period that was an interlude, and then back to the Americans. The big change today is really from a unipolar to a multipolar economy. So we're going to see many centers of different kinds battling out. So it will not be the Chinese century or the Chinese decade. China will be one of the major power players, but it will not be the only one.
World wealth has reached a record $263 trillion. But just a few people get to enjoy those increasing funds. Just 1% of the global population own almost 50% of it. And according to the Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report, the abnormally high wealth income ratios may spark a recession, as high disparity leads to income friction. Well, listen, talking of friction, Ebola is causing chaos for travellers, medical workers, world leaders, and even chocolate makers, because the price of cocoa is up because the main producers of the bean Ghana and the Ivory Coast, which produce over 60%, are next door to the Ebola-stricken countries, so Liberia, Sierra Leone and Guinea. Now, prices on cocoa futures have sparked by about a third in price. The Ebola outbreak is already set to cost the West African economy $33 billion. That's according to the World Bank. Now, as a consequence, the World Cocoa Foundation is donating $600,000 to its members to treat these diseases. So that will come from the members, which are known as the WCF. They have more than 100 members, which includes the likes of, you would have heard of them, Mars, Hershey and Nestle. But if you consider just one of these 100 chocolate giants, if we take Mars, for instance, has annual sales of over $30 billion. So really, to companies like that, this offering is just really chocolate peanuts. All right, let's talk about corporate news that's been moving and shaking the markets here in Russia. We'll get started with Russia's Lada Kalina. Well, it's planning to tweak the hood of the design to prevent cats from getting inside the hood. The current design has a gap in the engine part, which in the cold Russian winter, cats squeeze through to keep warm. That they can get caught in the engine when the driver revs up. Moving on, United Colors of Benetton plans to expand across Russia over the next 3 years. The Italian clothing retailer is the first European company to announce investments instead of a scale down. 40 new stores are in store. VTB, well, it's cutting personnel in Western European offices. Investment department employees at Russia's second biggest banking group will be the first to go. The move is to save costs. Net income fell more than 5 times in the first half of this year. Tim Kirby, well, he's back in a shirt.
That's right. I have earned the right to wear normal clothing again. Polymetal went up by 2%, so I made about $500.
Yay!
And I feel good, yes. And, Katie, the Pay Tim His Dues hashtag Twitter campaign is going amazingly. Tons of people, and by tons I mean 5, have sent messages that you need to pay up and we need to stop this madness right now. So I'm going to tell you what these people said while I spin the wheel and we'll see what we'll invest in next week. David Smith says, hey there, Katie, it's time to pay Tim his dues. Tina Ryan says, Tim is too smart for small-time stock market investment. And Stephen Gould says, dude, you only work 2 minutes a week? Oh, wait, that's what capitalist investors do, huh? Well, actually, Stephen, by the way, I work 2 jobs. I wake up at 5 a.m. every day. I have my own business outside of work that I'm working on, and I have kids. So guess what, buddy? I work pretty hard for it there. I work hard for the pittance I make. But we got, oh no, Aeroflot, no! Last time Aeroflot did horrifically because we got them just as some of the problems in Kiev started and flights were canceled. But maybe they've stabilized, hopefully. I enjoy flying an Aeroflot. We'll see you next week, I guess.
Oh, it's going to be an interesting one. I really like talking about airlines because it makes me think about holidays, you know?
Oh, yeah. But just remember, Katie, listen to the Twitterverse. They're telling you, give me the money.
Yeah.
Hashtag pay Tim his dues. See you next week.
Exactly that, Tim Kirby. Well done. Yes, we are winning again. We are back in the money. Loving it. All right, so Moscow had its first snow this weekend, so I'm going to go and buy myself a coat. I could do with a warm one. You can join me on Twitter and have a great weekend. Goodbye.